Hey folks, it's Fok, and welcome to another video, and as promised, this one is about the different types of witches that there are, and the different types of witchcraft paths that there are. I'm going to start off by saying that I am not going to be listing every single type of witch, and the ones that I am about to mention, before giving definitions, are two that I think you should look into yourself, or if you would like, I can do a future video on the other types of witches that I am not going to mention in this video. That said, and before I forget to mention, to be a witch, you don't have to label what kind of witch you are. You don't have to do any of that. All you have to do is just be a witch. If you like to have labels, this is helpful for you. I personally like to have labels, so in the end of the video, I will be mentioning what type of witch I am, but that's a disclaimer for you. Now, the two types of witches that I'm going to mention as a mini highly honorable mention that I think are really interesting to look into are the Gardnerian witches and the Alexandrian witches. Those two, from what I understand, are coven-based paths that it's really hard to find information on, so I don't feel like I know enough to give it more than an honorable mention, but they are definitely worth mentioning nonetheless. Now, I have 10 types of witches that I am going to actually go into today, so let's get started. The first type I'm going to be mentioning is the fairy witch, or the fairy witch practitioner. This is a solitary practitioner who usually works with the fae spirits or the nature spirits, and this specific witchcraft path and title originates from the Irish or Gaelic culture. The next path that I'm going to mention is the druid path. This druid path is spiritual, but it has no specific dogma to actually stand by, but it does regard things as spiritual. They believe, generally druid witches believe, that another world exists that we can't always see, and they tend to worship nature and celebrate the natural passages of nature a bit more than others might. The origins of this are Irish and Celtic. I cannot say that I'm going to have the origins for every single witchcraft path, but I did do my best to do that for you. And the next type of path that I'm going to be talking about is the Green Witch. They are a practitioner who uses mostly nature, and they usually build most of their own tools. They tend to work with Mother Nature, Mother Earth, Earth spirits. There are two types, if you want to go even further down the rabbit hole of naming yourself. There are two different types of green witches. There are herbal witches and floral witches, and you can guess what they tend to work with the most. The next path that I'm going to mention is the hedge witch. This kind of witch is a practitioner who communicates with and visits the spirit realm. They are called hedge witches because the term hedge is from history. Hedges usually go around cemeteries, edges of house properties, and so when people made this term and recoined it, hedge witches, they basically guard and communicate with the boundary between life and death, and spirit realm and not spirit realm. This path is usually very earth-based. Hedge witches usually tend to be healers, and they tend to be knowledgeable about plants, and often they are more likely to note the obscure shifts in nature, observe the obscure shifts in nature. The kitchen witch, I imagine, what are you thinking? Kitchen witches, you're thinking in the house, pouring potions in a thing, in a crock pot or something. That's not what it is. Kitchen witches are witches who practice mindfulness, and they make their entire home sacred. They're more likely to be pretty crafty and to improvise, and often they use their household things. They tend to have, from what I imagine, pretty peaceful homes, and they are likely to be really handy in a regular witchy situation, simply because they can improvise pretty well. And the next witch that I'm going to be talking about is fairly obvious, and that's solitary witch. Solitary witch is a practitioner who works alone. They don't go any covens, they don't go any associations. That being said, for example, as I mentioned earlier, Alexandrian and Gardnerian paths are coven-based, solitary witches cannot go into paths like that. Basically, if it's a coven-based path, you cannot be a solitary witch, and that is perfectly fine, but that is the basic gist of it. Now, the second one that's similar to that I'm going to mention is a secular witch. A secular witch tends to use tools like herbs, stones, and crystals, but they don't think of them as spiritual. They don't see any of their tools as spiritual. If anything, they kind of believe their tools come from nature and earth, but they don't worship any deities or spirits, and they probably don't work with any entities. And the next witch that I'm going to be talking about is the hereditary witch. The hereditary witch is a title that you can choose to have only if you come from a family of witches. You obviously don't have to use this term, but this option is available to you if you come from a family where, for example, your grandmother was a witch, but your mother wasn't. If you pick that up, you can still use the term hereditary witch, or if you shared tarot decks, which I don't advise. In a future video I'll explain that. If you share tarot decks, grimoires, all of that, that's a hereditary witch. If it's a family experience and it's passed down to you from family member to family member to family member. And I think, personally, I wish I had been a hereditary witch. That would have been so cool to be indoctrinated. I think this would have been great. I really like the ideas of witchcraft and Wicca overall. Going off topic though. Now, the next one that I'm going to mention is the Dianic path. This term comes from the 1970s in the United States, and this path is basically where you worship the mother, the maiden, and crone, the three forms of the goddess, except men cannot be in this path, as this was revived as a way to find a safe space for women. So, that's a little disappointing, but I guess that's why the eclectic path, the last one I'm going to mention, comes in handy. This, for example, is my path, but the eclectic path is when you kind of pick pieces from other paths that you think work best for you. For example, if you do want to worship the moon, you can pull this into your craft. If you do want to do a lot of kitchen stuff, pull that into your craft. It's basically cherry picking, but okay, as long as you're being respectful of closed practices from other cultures that aren't open to you. And that's a whole other situation, but I try to personally keep that in mind. That said, eclectic witches usually tend to listen to their higher selves over following a religion. I personally do not do that. I follow the Hellenic path, and I follow the Hellenic polytheist group of gods. I have a connection with a few, and I tend to work with crystals, energy work, a lot of that stuff, but I don't fit in any of the other paths that I mentioned, or any of the ones that I did not mention here. So the eclectic path tends to be a pickup of anybody who is kind of weird, even in the witch category. So those are the types of witches that I have mentioned today. If you would like me to make a new video with the second part of this, I will look into how many I missed and see if I can do some research on that, and I will make a video for that in the future. The next video that I'm going to be making is about meditation and its importance and how to do it and the benefits that it has on you. So, if you look forward to that, enjoy my mystical witchlings.